Hello everyone. Welcome to our joint International Women's Day special event hosted by the Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation, a research institute at the University of Queensland, as well as the Australian Research Council Industrial Transformation Training Centre for Uniquely Australian Foods. International Women's Day is a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. On International Women's Day, it's important to celebrate women's achievements and raise awareness about women's equality. So I would like to start by acknowledgement of country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianships of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. In today's presentation, we would like to explore the topic, Women in Leadership in Food and Agriculture, Shaping a More Equal Future. And I will be facilitating this session, and my name is Yasmina Sultanbawa, and I'm working at QAAFI as a professorial research fellow, and I'm the director of the ARC Uniquely Australian Foods Training Centre. We are delighted to have with us our guest speaker, Professor Henrietta Marrie, today. And this is to celebrate International Women's Day. I'm honored to have Professor Henrietta Marrie joining us today to celebrate International Women's Day. And Professor Marrie is an Indigenous heritage and biodiversity expert who has recently joined the ARC Uniquely Australian Foods Training Centre. Professor Marrie is an Indigenous rights activist, an expert in Indigenous intellectual and cultural property and heritage, as well as being a Gumoy Yidinji woman of clans born and raised in Yarrabah. Professor Marrie was the first Aboriginal person from Australia to be selected for a full-time professional position with the United Nations Agency, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity of the United Nations Environment Programme based in Montreal, Canada. Hello, Henrietta. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. And to start this conversation, I would like to for you to tell us something about yourself, please.
Hello, Yasmina, and hello, everyone out there. International Women's Day is a day of celebration, and it's also a day of remembering many of our women who have gone before us. And I'd like to certainly acknowledge my mother and my grandmothers for the work that they had done and for the resilience and strength to get through the atrocities that had happened in their removal from their particular country. Yeah, I was born and raised at Yarrabah, which is an Aboriginal community just southeast of Cairns, and it was a community which had been set up as a reserve where they had brought in the late 1800s. They had brought down people from the many different far north Cape York communities. Yarrabah was set up in 1897. I had to get that one right. 1897. And it became an Anglican mission. It was a community of one tribal group in the community in which they'd come to, and that was the Kunganji people. By 1930s, and I want to particularly put that point in, 1930s was when Norman Tyndale had come through and he recorded the genealogies of the many people. The reason behind that study that he and Birdsall had done was to basically understand the biological absorption of Aboriginal people. So the reason behind his genealogical study was to see how long it would take for the Aboriginal race to die out. Now, I mentioned 1897 and 1930s. Within that year, what Tyndale had recorded was that 50,000 tribal groups had suddenly been brought into Yarrabah through the separation process, and this was under the state government laws to be able to move people away from their families simply because they were of fairer skin. And so Yoruba, one tribal group in 1897, and then by 1930, suddenly 50 different tribal groups. So you can imagine the systematic destruction of a way of life, of culture, and of languages just at that time. But this was a time where both my grandparents were brought down from Kuki-Yalanji, Kuki-Imidi country, and they were brought into Yoruba. They were put into dormitories. So we had institutionalisation on the reserve, then further institutionalisation in dormitory system. My parents were both born in Yoruba, and therefore, but they themselves were also institutionalised in dormitories at the time they'd grown up. So I was lucky to escape the dormitory days in that by the 1950s, the dormitories were closed down. So I was able to be reared by my parents themselves, whereas my parents themselves were reared by, were actually in dormitory systems, so they weren't reared by their own family. But what I noticed was my parents, my grandparents, were one year Kuki-Yalanji, one Kuki-Imidi. They both maintained and kept their language, but they also understood the way of life of the people in Yoruba. And so what I grew up with were strong women around me who maintained their practices and also stood firm and strong in that one is they understood the white man's way and the white man's language. They knew how to use it to benefit themselves and also to rear their families. So knowing this kind of gives me hope that because of that strength and resilience of these women, and also my parent, my mother and my father, I come from a very strong line of leaders in that way. And so that gave me a lot of strength to be able to take the journey that I was able to take after I finished school and universities and was able to move through in and out the corridors and succeed in what I wanted to do. And many of my journeys have been throughout museums, understanding the cultural dimension of cultural properties that were held in museums, that were taken away from communities and put in museums. And also the understanding of the many different laws that continue to deny us access to sites and sacred sites in our particular region, simply because there were this huge scope of development that was taking place and didn't allow us to maintain the cultural practice at these sites. So everything was done in a way that we continue to tell the stories and handed down the knowledge through the stories and through the dances and through the songs that we continue today as Yidindi people. And I guess it was from that very beginning of living in Yoruba, then moving to Palm Island, which was a very segregated community on Palm Island, where apartheid was very much in existence, and I won't go through into that because it would be just such a long story to tell about my growing up in these spaces. But you know, so I was introduced to the politics of a way of life of our people, both in Yoruba and then on Palm Island, in terms of the politics and the issues of apartheid that also affected and impacted us. But at the same time, having parents and grandparents who came with the strength of what they had done and the way they'd gone through the challenges and the trauma which they had experienced allowed me to be able to feel the strength of them and their spirit to be able to move forward in the way that I had moved. And that, in a sense, had got me through to be able to work in places like the United Nations Environment Program with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the many challenges that I had faced as an Aboriginal woman working in a UN institution, being the very first Aboriginal person from Australia to work in such an institution. But at the same time, there were not many of us Indigenous people working at that time within the UN system. And so this was, for me, a great challenges and experience, but at the same time, understanding a way of doing things that would be able to in the future, give our people the knowledge system about the system and the way in which the traditional knowledge of food and medicine to the genetic resources can be accessed, but also understand the systems of law that would then protect that system of uses of genetic resources for food and agriculture, and then being able to understand how those international laws would then be implemented within our own countries. And there's so much more that we could probably talk about, but you know, this is but with the upbringing that I had in knowing bush food, in knowing bush medicine, and understanding that, and being able to have that experience of understanding that national law and then international law to be able to protect and safeguard our knowledge system was for me a great experience. And this is what I now want to bring to the Agricultural Research Training Centre, because there's so much that I would certainly love to do, and to be able to apply my knowledge and my understanding within this institution to work with my own people out there, and to be able to give them that knowledge base in how they can now use their knowledge system to build that economic growth within their own local communities. Because we do have the knowledge system, we have a great understanding of its uses, and now we have the land in which we can start growing the genetic resources, our bush food and our bush medicine. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrietta. Thank you so much for telling us about your parents and your grandparents and the person you are, the resilience that you've built up, and the role model you've become, and the mentor, and your generosity in sharing your knowledge. It comes through almost every time I speak to you, and the help that you are giving with the ARC Training Center as well. I just want to ask you, the leadership role model that you played when you became the first Aboriginal person from Australia to be represented in the United Nations Agency. What type of work did you do, and how did it help all First Nations people globally? Could you please let us know something about this role?
Let me just tell you about the position itself. I guess yes. to get to work with the United Nations, there was a journey, and one was after I'd finished my my degrees, I did a lot of publication. I did a lot of publishing, and I published a lot in the areas of Indigenous intellectual property rights associated with the arts, but also associated with land, and also associated with genetic resource use and the benefit sharing arrangement that comes with it. I guess it took me to the point where I ended up on an international committee of the Indigenous Biodiversity International Committee that was set up. There was then a position that came up with the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal. I applied for the position. I was successful in that position. That was in 1996, and I took the job on. It was a professional position which allowed me to research, analyse, and put together a report for the parties who were signatories to the convention. The convention, as is with a number of UN agencies, is that the parties themselves have to be a signatory to the convention, and then they would ratify the convention in their own state. This allowed me to pull together particularly information that related to Article 8J, 10C, 17.2 and 18.4. Many of them dealt with intellectual property, genetic resource use, benefit sharing arrangement, and the participation of Indigenous and local communities on a global scale. So the people I dealt with were mainly Indigenous people in colonised countries, as well as local communities in places such as the African communities, Asia, Middle East, and South Pacific. So we're looking at, on a global scale, about 1.2 billion people, which my work had contributed to the way governments would deal with and include Indigenous and local communities in their laws and policy when governing issues around genetic resource use and benefit sharing arrangements. And through the Secretariat, I was able to pull together reports. One of my first meetings was in Madrid, Spain. And it was there when government decided to adopt many of the recommendations which I had put forward in the report for them to consider. And some of those achievements had been the need to ensure intellectual property over and in safeguarding traditional knowledge systems and traditional knowledge associated with genetic resource use. That was then taken up by WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organisation, to consider such discussion, and today there is the Intergovernmental Committee on the protection of genetic resource use and access and benefit sharing. It was also a place where Madrid was also the country where the town where I was able to also put together the need to have an ad hoc working group, ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J. Mm-hmm. And that was also very successful. So and during my time at the Secretariat, I also put together the Aquagon Guidelines with social, cultural, and environmental impact assessment. And that was also adopted by the parties some years later. But these are some of the areas in which I work, and I was instrumental in moving the discussion of traditional knowledge, genetic resource use, intellectual property or safeguarding of knowledge systems, and benefit sharing arrangements discussion that would take place. Certainly at WIPO and at UNTAD, the United Nations Trade and Development. And Indigenous people were able to bring together the issues which confronted them in terms of genetic resource use. I guess going from that, it really, what we need to think about is how do we implement the convention or the outcome from the Convention on Biological Diversity in our nation state here in Australia, and take Queensland for example. Our laws at the moment says that the government or the Crown owns the plant and genetic resources that's out there. That also poses a problem in terms of Indigenous people being able to access those genetic resources, particularly for economic development purposes. And in some cases, there's a lot of information which is not getting out to the Indigenous community about the fact that they can access the genetic resources to develop economic development in a way in which they could access the knowledge they have and then get a permit to be able to access that plant and the seeds and the seedlings and grow them in their own backyard, or simply be able to move towards issues of agriculture. And I know we're going to be talking about agriculture in a minute. Thank you.
Yes. That's amazing, Henrietta. You've done so much, and translating that knowledge to Australia now, when the indigenous native food industry is really gaining momentum, is so important. And I think all that knowledge is very important at this time when we want Indigenous communities to own and lead the bush food industry. So you will play a key role and would be a role model for the communities. And I look forward to seeing your achievements in this area as well. So going back to the global UN theme for International Women's Day, which is women in leadership, women like you. We are celebrating successful women like you, Henrietta, who've worked so hard in spite of the hurdles that they have had, you know, and the trials. Your resilience is just amazing. I mean, you are an inspiration to all of us. So while we celebrate this theme, I would also like to reflect on the traditional and cultural connections to food and how women have been the keepers of knowledge. So I'm also a migrant woman, and I have migrated from Sri Lanka. And back home, the women play an important role as keepers of knowledge, especially around the culture of food, knowing what type of food to eat, the traditions surrounding the preparation and eating of these foods. For example, women would know, you know, about rice, what to give a pregnant woman, what to give a breastfeeding woman. All this knowledge, they have this knowledge. They have home gardens that they could feed their families. There was a connection to country and sharing of stories with families. And this was very important for our identity, to keep these traditions going and for our future generations. I would like to know, what about here in Australia? How would you relate Indigenous culture to women as keepers of knowledge? What are the opportunities for our communities? Could you please let us know?
Let me start with when working internationally. What I found was that about 80% or 85% of women were the knowledge holders in terms of agriculture and food.
Wow.
And, you know, they had a major role in feeding their families, taking that responsibility and nurturing their families, feeding their families. And so without women, you've got to really start understanding, well, in terms of family survival and how they survive, and particularly when you're looking across many different countries and the atrocities that they'd gone through. But back here in this country, and women too were keepers of that knowledge. They were the main breadwinners in their communities. They would gather food. They were the main food gatherers. And therefore, wild harvesting, as we call it today, had been going on for centuries in this country. And women were at the forefront of that. And today, what we're now seeing is that knowledge system, while in some places it may seem lost, there are so many of some of the same species that are found elsewhere where not just women, but men too are getting into this role of being able to do wild harvesting or go out and collect many of our bush food and bush medicine, use bush medicine. So we're in a really good position because we know that the bush food industry have been operating in this country for so many years later, in that non-Indigenous Australians were benefiting from using a lot of our knowledge, but also using the products that we gathered and begin to form small businesses and bringing in their own economy, moving towards developing that further. And I guess in some of the work that I had done, what I realized was that Indigenous people, they knew the knowledge. They knew the knowledge system. And when I talk about the knowledge system, it's a know-how, it's knowledge know-how in how to use particular plants, that may have had some kind of toxin in there, and what they needed to do before they ate it. The women, so it's all part of science. So that, and this is the background knowledge which they had in order to ensure their survival, but also ensure that their community weren't poisoned from the product they had. So, you know, we have we're in the best place in that we have land.
Yes.
We have the knowledge base, knowledge system of the uses of these plants out there for food. We also have the knowledge in terms of how these plants relate to medicinal properties. We have the knowledge base on where to find them, but it's unfortunate that when colonization started, it separated us from many of the countries where we would find these foods. But today now we are moving back into that space. Many of the communities have native title. Many of the communities have leasehold land within some of these regions. And so many of these communities that are set up, particularly on the reserve land, have got huge acreage of land. So we have the land, we have the knowledge system associating us with the traditional uses of the genetic resources. What we now need to have is the knowledge base in how to not just do wild harvesting and collect and sell to the third party who then sells to the restaurants, or doing wild harvesting of products and selling it to restaurants, but they're small quantities. If we are to get involved in this industry, we need to be able to be prepared to move into towards the agricultural component and practices. So if we move in a way that we are growing this food, now some people say, well, it's a very Western term, we are going to lose it, but I see it as a way of, if we want to practice and protect the plants that we have used for centuries, or our ancestors have used, then what a good way of doing it by one is having small farms, growing traditional food. You're bringing it in a position where you will continue to grow them. The young people will continue to know about those traditional food and where they can sell it. So they're not only bringing back a tradition and knowledge base and understanding of that, they're also developing a local economy in which they can then again benefit from that by building and growing that economy based on the traditional food and knowledge system which they had, but bringing it in a way that they're now practicing an agricultural practice which had been brought in by non-Indigenous people many years ago. Or they can choose to just have backyard gardens where they're growing traditional food, and then one day move into the space if they want to get bigger. But the other issues that we need to consider when we're doing all of this is to look at how do we protect those very knowledge which had been there for centuries. Our intellectual property laws in this country do not recognise those communal rights over the cultural property. They do not, including in terms of the plant genetic resource rights, they don't recognise the knowledge system of local communities and Indigenous peoples. So we still have a long way in this country to really ensure that the knowledge system and how we use it is going to be safeguarded. And this is something that we need to work on and need to work with expertise in this field to ensure protection. I guess when it comes down to access and benefit sharing, it's another issue again, because it's about non-Indigenous people taking those plants, taking those genetic resources, growing it without our knowledge and without our input, but and making the profit without any going back to the community who would use those particular products and use it in a way that they would benefit from it, because either they're medicinal as well as they're also a food source. So we still in this country need to look at some kind of benefit sharing arrangements and policies that would look at ensuring that Indigenous people would benefit from the uses of plant genetic resources which they've used for many years and now are being used by the non-Indigenous industry areas. So I guess there's a lot in which we can probably do together, because we need to incorporate both knowledge system and science and understand the value of that knowledge system of Indigenous peoples throughout this country.
Yes, very interesting, Henrietta. I totally agree that empowering the communities with knowledge on how to have those negotiations with Indigenous or non-Indigenous partners when they come to buy the product from them is key. And once that knowledge is there, then everybody can form this partnership and work together in getting this industry forward, but also benefits going back into communities and communities to be the leaders and owners of these native food or bush food value chains. And
exactly, and I think you know what QAAFI is doing, what the Agricultural Research Centre and Training is doing, is putting together, is connecting. We're kind of connectors. We're connecting non-Indigenous industry group with Indigenous entrepreneurs and industry groups who are working to do wild harvesting, but working together. And we're also looking to train these people so that they're much more aware of their uses of bush food, and also look at how do they then move towards building a local economy, and so that they are benefiting, and that knowledge is staying with them in the community, but also the community themselves are benefiting from the very resources which they themselves had continued to use for centuries. And this is where I really am looking forward to further working in this space with you in how we get that, how we inform also these communities about the how to protect their rights in this area, but also how to work together. And where they as knowledge holders and they as the keepers of those knowledge, and moving into a space which is foreign in some ways, but not so foreign in that it was always been part of the economy. So now we're just bringing it out and we're exposing it further into our wider society in this country. And you know, I think it's something which is needed, because you're remembering the fact that we have the land, and we just probably need to access further land in order to be able to grow these products and again harvest those products, and also then find the buyers out there and the networking. I really see a great improvement in possibly getting more Indigenous people and the young people particularly involved in, one is that get to know their bush food industry a lot better. They will get to understand the uses of those particular species in which they use, and they will be building their own economy in their local communities, and working with the broader community in how they can grow their local economy based on their knowledge system and bush food.
Thank you, Henrietta. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I look forward to continue working with you and developing these best practice protocols as you have shown us, and developing the policies, the right way to work, and really having a respectful and inclusive culture for all of us to work together, and bringing alternative learning pathways for Indigenous communities and also our students, so that they learn from each other and we can build a strong collaboration and successful social enterprises. So I'm really grateful for your knowledge, and I'm so thankful that you are working with us at the ARC Training Center for Uniquely Australian Foods, and you are an honorary professor at QAAFI at the University of Queensland. We are truly blessed to have you, and thank you so much for your time today. And I look forward to many more conversations in the years to come, because there is so much of work to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So if you have enjoyed this conversation between Henrietta and myself, and listened to Henrietta as an amazing role model for all of us to follow her, and she's such an inspiring person, I would urge you all to sign up for the Merle Pledge. The Merle Pledge is something that many high-profile conferences, events, task forces, and media outlets are bringing forth, so that we understand that we have equity in representation of women. There is gender balance. At UQ, we have tailored this to create an initiative known as the Merle Pledge. The Merle Pledge is an effort to be substantially improve women's representation in public and professional forums. So we encourage all academics and professional staff from all backgrounds and genders to take the pledge and to join the worldwide movement to advance gender equity in academia and other occupations.